All right. So, hello everyone. My name is Dominic. I think I recognize almost all of you already from some of my other classes, but it's great to see all of you. I'm a second year student here. In terms of why I chose to study this topic, um, I Asia studies is really kind of one of my favorite things to do, particularly China. China is a very, very popular subject of study right now. I think last year I literally wrote like 6 papers about China. So for ISA West, I wanted to do something which I thought might be less studied, right? I had a feeling there would probably be a lot of people there reporting on Chinese politics. I want to do something adjacent to that, which is Japanese politics, which I'm also extremely passionate about. And so I actually came up with this as a brand new idea. I actually had not written this paper for any other class. It would have been easier if I had. And so what I'm showing you today is a work in progress, although we're coming to the end of it now, but yeah. So starting out with a quote from the Japanese Prime Minister, "Ukraine today may be Asia tomorrow." Prime Minister Kishida Fumio. Just a side note, in this presentation, I'm conforming to the Japanese name order because that's what the Japanese government has requested, at least for government officials. So Kishida is his family name. So just a brief overview of Japan for any of those of you who might not be completely familiar with it. The Prime Minister is Kishida Fumio. The capital, of course, is Tokyo, the largest city in the whole world. Population as large as California. Population of Japan is 125 million people and dropping. Japan's population is shrinking every year, but that's a subject for another day. The emperor is Naruhito, only country in the world that still has an emperor, which is pretty interesting. And it's a constitutional monarchy, but of course, a democratic is what that means. So Japan's current security situation in East Asia. I've got here a quote from the Japanese Foreign Minister, Hayashi Yoshimasa. He said, "While the international community is facing changes defining an era, the very foundation of the international order is being shaken, and the world stands at historic crossroads. As Japan is finding itself in the midst of the most severe and complex security environment since the end of World War II, maintaining and developing a free and open international order based on the rule of law are becoming as important as it has ever been." So he's kind of laying it all out here. Of course, words and actions are two very different things, and I'm trying to measure the difference between those two things. You'll notice that this might sound very similar to US rhetoric, while Japan and the US are extremely close allies, so that's probably not a coincidence. So for this paper, my idea was to examine Japan's national security strategy documents. They've only ever published two, one in December 2013, and then the other 9 years later in December 2022. So it's kind of topical. And I thought, it's pretty straightforward because there's only two of them. So it did seem like low-hanging fruit, I'll admit. But what is a national security strategy? The US also publishes documents like this. It's a document published periodically by the Japanese government, and it lists the country's national security concerns and its plans to address them. It's written by the Japanese National Security Council and approved by the cabinet. We also have a National Security Council here in the United States. Again, that coincidence might not be a mistake. The document is purposefully vague, with further details on implementation provided in supporting documents like the National Defense Strategy. And that's the case for the United States as well. Many supporting documents, the strategy is just kind of broad and vague. And as I mentioned earlier, there's only two of them, published 9 years apart, which I thought would be perfect for an examination. So my hypothesis, despite the country's association with pacifism, Japan's role in international security has been expanding in recent years due to rising regional and global threats. When you have a hypothesis, it needs to be falsifiable. Otherwise, it's not scientific. And falsifiable means it can be proven false. So you can't have something which is just a fact. It's just unequivocally true. It has to be something that someone somewhere could disagree with. And so there are scholars who would say, no, that's not the case. I disagree. Japan is the same as it's ever been, or maybe its role is shrinking, and they can provide their evidence for that. But I think its role has been expanding, and I'm going to show you why. My methodology is content analysis. I pulled my definition of content analysis here from Columbia University. Hopefully they won't come after me. I don't know if you guys have already done, well, you'll learn about content analysis soon enough if you haven't already, but it's a research tool used to determine the presence of certain words, themes, or concepts within some given qualitative data, usually, for example, text. And using content analysis, researchers can quantify and analyze the presence, meanings, and relationships of such certain words, themes, or concepts. This is a methodology that I believe Professor Skniasny is quite the fan of. I've actually read some of her work using content analysis. So when I looked at these documents, there were three primary threats, so to speak, that Japan listed out in the new document. The first was Russia's invasion of Ukraine, China's aggression toward Taiwan, and North Korea's nuclear missile ambitions. That last one is pretty key because whenever North Korea likes to test its nuclear missiles and fire them off into the ocean, it fires them into the waters surrounding Japan. And if you're actually in Japan when that happens, an air raid siren goes off and you have to take cover, and it's not fun. You could see they would be very upset about that. So these things shouldn't really come as a surprise, but I wanted to see to what degree Japan really means it. And so I combined a qualitative analysis of the text. I actually read the text, the two documents from 2013 and 2022. And then I actually used some quantitative analysis as well, which I'll show you in a little bit. So the new area of interest for Japan is the Indo-Pacific. This is a very recently popularized term. Back in the day, it was the Asia-Pacific. The Asia-Pacific is gone now, as I'll show you in my analysis. Now it's the Indo-Pacific, which is a broader region. This was really, the term's been around for a long time, but the popularization was really spearheaded by the United States, unsurprisingly. And the Indo-Pacific is this broad ocean region and encompasses the Indian and Pacific Oceans. So it's bigger than the Asia-Pacific. And there's this slogan, a free and open Indo-Pacific, or FOIP. Again, the United States likes to say this a lot. Japan is also subscribing to it because they talk about it in their document. And this is code, I think, primarily for countering China. Things like South China Sea disputes, things like that, maintaining the trade which passes through the South China Sea, the Indo-Pacific, which is billions upon billions of dollars of the world's trade. It's extremely important. Obviously, when it comes to politics and diplomacy, people don't always say things directly. They always say things kind of softly. That's what I think FOIP is. So a major priority in the document was strengthening the Japan-US alliance. However, what I'm going to show you later on is despite the fact that Japan says they want this, in my analysis of the document, I've actually found some evidence to the contrary. But the Japan-US alliance is at the center of Japan's strategy, so they say, and maintaining a free and open Indo-Pacific as well as a free and open international order will require the help of the United States. And so to this end, Japan wishes to further engage the United States in Asian regional security. They actually even say in the document that they recognize the United States as the most powerful country in the world. And so they find it's a very important ally in this endeavor. However, many people have been arguing that, especially ever since the Donald Trump administration, when the US kind of pulled back a bit from its allies, ever since then, our allies have been concerned that we might not be so reliable, that depending on whoever takes office, the US can come and go like the wind. And that's not a position a country wants to be in. So a lot of them have been seeking to kind of bulk themselves up to be more self-reliant. And I think from my analysis that Japan is doing that as well, that while they say that the US-Japan alliance is important to them, and I'm sure it is, I think they might also be hedging. They might also be strengthening themselves to make themselves less reliant on the United States in the event that a future administration might pull back from Japan, which seems very possible. If you've listened to recent political debates, isolationism seems to be a popular idea in some political circles now. So Japan talked about increased security cooperation with its allies and like-minded countries. I like that phrase. That's what they said. Key partners include Australia, India, the Philippines and Vietnam, South Korea, and Taiwan. Australia and India, with Japan and the United States, form the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or the Quad, which is probably the most important organization in Indo-Pacific security. It's not an alliance. India will definitely emphasize that it's not an alliance because India is more careful about how it balances its relationships with the great powers of the world. And so they don't quite want to ally themselves so firmly, but it's a dialogue, as they emphasize, and it's definitely kind of a premier tool in that region. The Philippines and Vietnam, that's not really surprising because those are the two countries which are most vehemently fighting the territorial disputes in the South China Sea. Vietnamese and Filipino fishermen are regularly kind of arrested and by Chinese authorities for fishing in the South China Sea, and it's a whole mess if you're familiar with that situation. South Korea, not so surprising, especially recently, President Biden actually had a trilateral summit with the leaders of Japan and South Korea at Camp David. And which is pretty remarkable because South Korea and Japan have had shaky relations in the past, despite being so similar, kind of institutionally, kind of politically and socially. Historical grievances, which are very well founded, have kind of been the basis for some friction, but things are looking up. We'll see if it continues. And then Taiwan, which is not internationally recognized as a country, but Japan did list it. Not so surprising, they've been pretty open about wanting to defend Taiwan if it were to come under threat. So in my quantitative analysis, I thought it would be a really cool idea. It's so basic, but I just thought it would be so much fun and revealing. I determined 25 key terms, which I believed would illustrate important differences between the two documents, 2013 and 2022. I counted the number of times each term occurs in the documents, and then I recorded them for comparison. Words like defense, missile, democracy, countries like China, Iran, India, because I felt it could be very revealing. Not that it's hard proof that just because a word appears less, it's less important, but I think it's evidence at least to something. And so I'm going to show you here. So here I have my data, and sadly, not sure if the resolution quite gets it, but you can see words like aggression, ASEAN, Asia Pacific, China, cyber, defense. So the blue bar is 2013, the orange bar is 2022. Look at the word defense, almost double the occurrence. Democracy, disinformation, missile, military, peace, Russia, and so on. Some of my key findings from doing this just kind of basic analysis were a few things. I found a greatly increased incidence of words like defense, military, missile, and Taiwan, which I feel to have such a dramatically increased incidence of those words indicates a more militant or defensive stance. I think that's kind of evidence to that. Because remember, some may argue that Japan is not becoming more militant. And I found increased incidence of words like China, democracy, and threat, which kind of supports the idea. Remember, my hypothesis is that rising threats are triggering Japan to become more defensive. And so seeing these words, like China, for example, which is mentioned many more times in the new document than the one from 9 years ago, I think that kind of supports that idea. Meanwhile, we saw greatly decreased incidence of words like ASEAN, Japan-US alliance, terrorism, and peace. In regards to the word terrorism, maybe that shouldn't come as a surprise. 9 years ago, or actually we're in 2023, so it's 10 years ago now, the war on terror was much more salient than it is today. It's still important. There's still a lot of activity in the Middle East and elsewhere to combat terrorism, but in many ways, it feels like the policy priority of yesterday. And again, this is kind of some evidence to that the word is mentioned so much less in the new document, but also less mention of Japan-US alliance, dramatically less. I feel like if it was really so central, you would expect it to, either stay the same or perhaps increase, but it's actually mentioned a lot less. Also decreased incidence of India, Iran, and North Korea. Take that as you will. Either it's important or it's not important. And then completely new words which didn't appear in the 2013 documents. Words like aggression, disinformation, invasion, self-reliance, and Ukraine. So disinformation, for example, the information space, kind of the battles in the information space, are more important now than they've ever been. And so it makes sense that in 2022, Japan will be talking about things like cyber defense and combating disinformation, because in 2013, it was less of an issue. I mean, far fewer people even had smartphones back then, and the mobile web was much more primitive. Invasion, that shouldn't come as a surprise. Russia's invasion of Ukraine completely rocked the world last year, and it plays a big role in this document. That's why also Ukraine is mentioned. And then self-reliance. Self-reliance wasn't even in the 2013 document, but it's in 2022. I think this might serve as evidence that Japan is trying to become more self-reliant, to wean itself off of its dependence on the United States for security. And then, as I mentioned earlier, in 2013, there was very heavy use of the word Asia-Pacific, but it's completely gone from the new document. Instead, there's heavy use of Indo-Pacific. So it seems that Indo-Pacific has completely replaced Asia-Pacific, which may not come as a surprise, but there you go. And so what does it all mean? So the new document makes much greater use of military terms, like I told you, which likely indicates a more defensive posture. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has clearly played a key role in motivating Japan's increasingly defensive stance. In addition, an increased threat perception of China has also been a key motivator for Japan's expanding role in international security. And despite Japan's desire to further engage in security cooperation with the United States, the country also appears to be pursuing greater self-reliance in its defensive capabilities. And so, like I said, this is a work in progress. That's all I've got for now, but I absolutely welcome your feedback. So thank you so much.